I'm going to talk about some of the memories my grandmother had of the airship station here at Willingdon, and she used to speak about it to me when I was a child and tell me what it was like around here. But first of all, I'll just describe Willingdon at the time when the airship station was built here. Willingdon village was centred around Church Street with 3 or 4 shops, the school and most of the houses, so that was the sort of main larger part of Willingdon. Here at Lower Willingdon it was sort of made up of a few farms. There was Dan's Farm, Meachant's, Morning's Mill, Carter's Farm, and so it was mostly open land. And then you had the associated labourers' cottages which were attached to the various farms. There was a large market garden. Of the cottages, most of these have been demolished now and redeveloped. A few of them do remain. At the Triangle there was the blacksmith's forge and wheelwrights, and that is on the site of where you've got Wilmot's garage. Then you've got Southdown cottages, much as they look today, and this was where there was one little shop, the only shop in Lower Willingdon. There was the British Queen, but of course it didn't look like it does today. It was a plain, square, white building with a slate roof. Over the other side of the Triangle were a couple of buildings. One of them is Brains the Butcher's today, and that was then called Orchard House, and surrounding it were large orchards on the site where are now built the shops at Lower Willingdon. Orchard House was used as a laundry, and you would see all the washing hanging out amongst the trees in the orchards. Then next to that, where Willingdon Court is now, was called the White House, and this had been an old farmhouse, and there was a large barn there and several outbuildings. And this is more or less what there was at Lower Willingdon, near where the airship station was to be built. Wannock Lane went off to the left, and up there was a tiny Baptist chapel, the little chapel cottages and another large house beside them. From the Triangle right over to Willingdon Windmill there was nothing. This land was just used as open farmland. It was owned by Wannock Farm and was used for grazing, and some of it had been part of the R.N.A.S estate. A distant cousin of my grandmother's, her husband had bought some of the land from Lord Willingdon in February 1913, and that was sort of like behind what's Brains the Butcher's and out towards where you've got Thurrock Close along the main road there, and up to where Totu Rec, Coppice Avenue is. And he used that to make it into a chicken farm so that he could supply eggs to his business up in London. So this just paints a picture of what Lower Willingdon was like at the time when the First World War started. In 1914, my grandma Elsie Wooler was aged 20, and she lived with her parents at Rosebank Cottage, Lower Willingdon. As I said, Willingdon was a somewhat sleepy, quiet place, a typical rural farming area. In 1914, the government chose the land here for an airship station, and the villagers were not at all happy about it. They knew it meant hundreds of men would be arriving in the village, lots of noise, vehicles, activity, and also the villagers would not be able to go on to the land anymore. The site covered 142 acres, and there were 4 public footpaths across the land, which were in constant use all the time. But it meant from 1914 until 1923 that the villagers weren't able to use them because they couldn't have access to this land. Part of the land belonged to Wannock Farm and was used for grazing, but the area near the Triangle was owned by George Morris, and as I said, he was a distant relative of Elsie's father. He had a chicken farm here, and he was extremely unhappy when the land was requisitioned, because he'd only bought the land in 1913, and suddenly here we were in 1914 and it was being taken away from him. So Grandma said there was suddenly lots of activity here in the early part of 1915. Lots of vehicles, building materials, all this coming into the village. All the fences and most of the hedges dividing the small field on the land that they were going to use were taken down, and the hedges were pulled out, and small copies of trees halfway across the site had to be cut down. This was because they needed large open space for the airships to take off and land. Then they put new fences all the way around the perimeter of the site to prevent the public going onto it, and they made large gates at 2 entrances. There was one entrance at the triangle, which was the main entrance, and one at the top of Wannock Lane. Later on there was another entrance which was made from the main road, approximately where Thurrock Close is now. So you can imagine that the local people were not at all pleased about all this, as now, if they wanted to walk from Wannock Lane, say to the Wind or the Watermill, or down to the main road, they couldn't go on the footpaths. They had to walk all round the roads, as they had no access to the land where they normally went. And it was a much, much greater distance for them to have to go all the way round by way of the roads. So as you can imagine, they weren't at all happy about this. The Willingdon miller took his cart to and fro through these fields up to the Triangle and up to Upper Willingdon, and he also took them through the fields up to Wannock Watermill. The sheep from Wannock Farm were still allowed to graze on the land, but all of Mr. Morrish's chicken huts were demolished and taken down near the Triangle and had to be removed. Soon after Christmas 1914, there was knocks on the doors, and it was the billeting officer. He was calling at all the local houses asking if there was any room for a naval man to stay. This was because when they were building the airship station, initially there weren't enough huts built to house all the men needed to run the station. Well, quite a lot of people in Willingdon had room, as many of them had sons who had joined the army or navy for the war. Grandma's 2 brothers, Harry and Ernest, had joined the Royal Sussex Regiment, and they were away with their regiment, and so of course the bedroom they shared was not in use. So my great-grandparents, Emily and David, said yes, they could have 2 young men living there until all the accommodation huts were built. I think they probably felt also that they were helping. Their sons had gone away, and these were somebody else's sons who'd come down here, and perhaps they felt it was a little way they could help as well. They had 2 young mechanics named Walter and Harold. They were aged about 19 or 20, very polite young men. Of course, my great-grandparents were paid for having the men there. They got 3d per man per night, so this was 6d a day for the 2 men. This came to 3 shillings and 6d a week, which would be about 18p in modern money. The average weekly wage was then about 25 shillings, £1 25p in modern money. So it was almost like an extra day's wage each week. It was funny really, because some of the villagers then decided the airship station was not quite as bad as they thought it would be, as now they were earning money by housing some of the young men. A few officers lived with Mrs. Lean over at the Thatched Cottage, Wannock, and there were 4 at Upper Willingdon with Mr. Morgan, that's my husband's great uncle, and he lived at Hockington House, which was the Lavender Gardens, so he had 2 officers there, and Mr. Vine also had 2 officers at his farmhouse in Church Street. The day the first airship flew was the beginning of July 1915, because the airship station was commissioned on the 6th of July 1915. Grandma and her friend were walking back from their business. They were dressmakers in Old Town, and they were coming along Red Lion Street, now called Wish Hill, and they suddenly heard a noise overhead and saw an airship flying above them. The pilot flew really low over them, and 2 young men called out to them. They were going ooh and waving as they went overhead, and Grandma and her friend waved back. This was the first sight of an airship in the sky, but it became a normal sight to see the airships taking off and flying overhead every day, and also all the men around the village. I have a postcard dated 1916 that a lady wrote saying she is sitting in the doorway of a cottage at the British Queen, because there were cottages behind attached to the British Queen, and she was watching the airships flying overhead. Usually 2 airships left, often very early in the morning as Grandma was walking to work, and sometimes even before they got up, sort of as soon as it was light, like 4 o'clock in the morning, because it was often very still then. She'd hear them taking off and flying over their cottage, over the downs. And later in the war they also flew at night, and there were quite a lot of night flights, and you could hear them up in the air and you could see their lights, and they had special landing lights down at the airship station to guide them in. The young men used to go to Willingdon Church every week, and some went to the little Baptist chapel up at Wannock Lane. In the early years of the station, they also sometimes went to a soldiers' club, held in the evenings in the school at Church Street. Here there were newspapers, books, writing paper, etc., which was provided for them by a special fund that the villagers maintained, and there would be card games, strictly no gambling of course. There was also a piano there, and they could have a sing-song and play that. And some of the ladies from the village took turns to make them hot drinks, but absolutely no alcohol allowed. When off duty, the men went to the Wheatchief, sometimes the Red Lion, but more often to the British Queen, which of course was almost right next to their base at the Triangle. Some evenings they were taken in one of their lorries to Eastbourne to the cinema, although latterly they had a cinema of their own on the base. They also went to dances that were held at the Winter Garden and the Saffrons Room. It was here that some of them met the local girls, and 1 of 2 of them married local girls, and there were reports in the local paper of their weddings. When there were weddings, often an airship with a couple of their mates would fly over the church. At one wedding they flew one very low over the church as the bride and groom were coming out, and for a prank they dropped a lucky boot out of the airship. It hit a roof of the house and bounced off and caused quite a commotion when it landed in the road, but luckily it didn't hit anyone, and the airship continued to circle round and round very low over the young couple as they greeted all their friends. As small wooden accommodation buildings were built on the airship station at Lower Willingdon, the men gradually moved out of the private houses and into these accommodation huts on the base. They even had their own cinema there. They held dances and concerts, to which they invited villagers, and sometimes quite a number of the villagers went there. During this time, life was quite different in Willingdon. It certainly wasn't the quiet village where nothing much went on anymore, because there was always activity, and there was up to 200, 300 personnel there. In the summer of 1918, they held a huge sports day and a fete on the grounds of the airship station, and I think it was over 2,000 local people from Willingdon, Polegate, Eastbourne and the surrounding areas went to join in. There were also fetes, concerts and dances held at the Wannock Tea Gardens, because of course that was very close to the actual airship station land. And they held these especially for the men of the airship station. Some of the officers lived there, and of course, as I said, at the old thatched cottage before the huts were finished, and they would hold fetes and various events there to raise funds to give the men some sort of extra treats and comforts perhaps during the winter. Just before Christmas 1917 there was a bad fatal accident when 2 airships collided on the downs above Willingdon. Grandma told me that about 9 p.m. her father had gone out of the back door which faced the downs and was bringing in some coal for their fire. It was snowing. It was a very cold, foggy day. But he saw something glowing sort of in the sky above the downs, and he called Grandma, who ran outside to see, and they watched this glowing through the snow and fog. And then they heard a terrific bang, like a big explosion. They didn't know what it was, but a neighbour came around a bit later, and he said he'd heard the airships had crashed up on the downs and that bombs had exploded. The next day, of course, the news soon spread that one young man had been killed and there had been others who were badly injured. So Grandma and her father and a couple of the neighbours decided to walk up on the downs in the snow, it had stopped snowing, to see if they could see anything. They walked across towards Willingdon Hill Farm, which is sort of on the border of Willingdon and Jevington, right up on the top above Willingdon. And there they saw a group of people standing around. Some of them were villagers who'd also gone up to see. There was a tangle metal of an airship by the farm buildings, and area around it you could see the ground was burnt. Some of the station men were moving pieces of wreckage on a cart from a bit further away towards the barn. Everyone felt really very shocked and sad, especially as just 5 days before that Grandma said there had been a Christmas dance and social at the station to which many of the locals had gone. And the R.N.A.S, the concert party, had given a super entertainment. It all finished with carol singing, and it had been such a happy occasion. Then in the spring of 1918, some ladies called Wrens came to work at the airship station, Women's Royal Naval Service. Until then it had only been men, with some local women employed on domestic duties on the base. So the young women lived in a large, big, elegant house in Church Street, Willingdon, called Shortlands, which they called Shortlands Hostel, because it wasn't seemly for young women to be living on a base and sleeping there at night where there were all these men. By then there were about 300 men. So these young ladies could be seen marching in groups down the road, down Church Street, and then down what is now Cooper's Hill, towards Lower Willingdon. Sometimes a lorry would come up to take them down to the station. They also cycled to and fro to Lower Willingdon. As I said, this was not down the main road, which of course wasn't there then, but along Church Street to Cooper's Hill and down to the Triangle that way. In 1918, when they had news that the war had ended, there was a special service up at the church, and over 100 of the air station men went with the villagers to this service at the church, and their band played for all the hymns. Almost immediately, the airships stopped flying, certainly in any numbers at all, maybe the odd one or two went up, and then many of the men started to leave. By February 1919, there were very few left here. And in August there was a big auction selling off all the buildings and equipment. There were advertisements, and Grandma said people came from quite a distance to bid on these buildings. You know, people would buy them for their farms and all sorts of different things. The huge airship hangars and all the huts were dismantled and taken away, and very little remained. And by 1920, no one lived on the site at all. There were still some men, but by now they lived in private houses, because obviously it was cheaper to have them living in private houses than it was to try and keep areas of the base occupied. It was all quiet again here at Willingdon, where 300 men had once lived. But the locals still weren't allowed on the land, and they were getting really annoyed about this. There were questions with the council were asking their Member of Parliament, the Member of Parliament was asking in the Houses of Parliament why the people of Willingdon could still not get onto the land, their public footpaths, and the Air Ministry was saying, it was for the safety of the villagers, the site wasn't safe. Of course there had been explosives there, whether that had all been cleared, hopefully it had. There were actually no accidents following when the footpaths were opened and the land was accessible again. But it wasn't until the beginning of 1923 that they were able to use these footpaths again. And the land was then given back to the various people that it had been requisitioned from. However, some things remained, and I can remember some of these. There was a large building which had once been the engineering and motor workshop, and that was down in what we now call Coppice Avenue. There were 2 of the buildings converted into bungalows. Then one of them, behind the big motor workshop, became the Willingdon Library. Another one was the Willingdon Rifle Club. And I remember all of those except the 2 buildings that were made into bungalows, although I do have photographs of those because George Morris and his family lived in one of those for a while. I do remember the huge concrete blocks on land beside what we now call Broad Road, which was one of the service roads. And all this area was covered with blackberries. You used to get the best blackberries ever down Broad Road area. And we used to say, oh, we're going over the air station, even when I was small. And as children, we used to play with friends up on these big concrete blocks. These weren't mooring blocks. They didn't have rings in the middle. They had like 2 metal posts coming up the top with like screw threads on them. Not absolutely sure what they were used for, but I can remember them quite distinctly. Because Broad Road was just a stony track then, one of the old airship service roads. And then there were concrete blocks, mooring blocks with metal rings in. There were 1 or 2 of these across the land, sort of where Willingdon Primary School area and some of the Coppice estate is now. But there are 5 which still remain in Donkey Hollow, and there's 1 in Wannock Avenue, I think 2 in Downsview Road. There's 1 small hut from the air station which is used as a garden shed in Wannock Lane, and this is the house St George's, which was built by Mrs Morris after her husband George died, and that was their home. And she took 2 of the buildings from the airship station up there. I remember 1 as an apple store because they had a large orchard there. The other one, which remains, is used as a garden shed. But apart from that, there is really nothing remaining of the airship station. And you would never know that there was ever an airship station here at Lower Willingdon, which was so vital to the security of the ships sailing in our waters during World War I.